Then we will cross the Atlantic and with Anne Deysine and to ask the question, can the rule of law and can be restored also in United States? You have the floor for 20 minutes, please.
Okay.
Thanks.
Thank you very much, Mrs. Chair, and thank you to the organizers. This is a beautiful conference. And also thank you to the other speakers who all had very thought-provoking things. As to my talk, I had first decided to be a little more optimistic and change the title to How Can the Backsliding Be Stopped, and even more optimistic, and the rule of law maybe be restored. But I'll be much less optimistic because the damage is done in the US. So we're no longer talking about prevention. The US, of course, is very important because it's an established democracy. I would qualify that because in France we have a tendency to think the US is a democracy. For me, except for 20 years, it's never been a full democracy, but it was much better than nothing. So there is this type of democracy, and what is striking to me is the speed of the backsliding. So the type of work, prevention work, is really very important. And when we look at the reasons, of course, many people will say it's Trump, and it would be a big mistake to think it is Trump. Trump did not come out of nowhere. And when I try to explore the relationships between now populism, to me, right-wing populism, seen as an instrument. That's to say, Trump being able to capture the people that were unhappy with inequality, being felt left aside, etc. So the relationships between populism, illiberalism, and authoritarianism, I think it's important to realize two things about Trump. He's just the product of several decades of the right and the storytelling about the left capturing the media, capturing the court. And he was able to build on that. If we look at the Project 25, the big document, almost 1,000 pages, prepared by the Heritage Foundation, several chapters, and we may have the impression that Trump is just implementing the book, the reforms. What happens is a sort of eerie, uncanny coincidence between one person, Trump, with the idea that he wants to run the US like he ran his business, and in fact being used by those people that have dressed up his acts under some kind of ideological, doctrinal things, so that when we look at somebody who is now at the Office of Management and Budget, a very powerful job in the White House, who wrote the chapter on destroying the administrative state, because Trump wants to fire civil servants, fire the heads of commissions, etc. In fact, Trump and Musk, during the 6 months of the Doge experiment, they're all working, pushing in the same direction. As to the sort of ideological dressing of Trump's ideas, there is at least one specialist in the room, but I've read quite a few things. I've read the book by Laura Fields. I've read, what's his name, Miranda, Les Lumières Sombres. And when you read that, you realize how complex it is. You know, there is the post-liberals, Vermeer, that we mentioned before. There is the hard right, the reaction. We'll discuss the Silicon Valley. But what is striking to me is that although they have lived very different views, very different objectives, there is a common point on we want an autocratic regime, we want a strong man, and democracy is a danger, and democracy is an obstacle to innovation, to progress, etc. Now, maybe first rays of hope, I'll try to, because the objective, we were supposed to find rays of hope, which I found very difficult, but the first one, which is not structural, is the fact that Trump was able to keep together an extremely strange coalition of the traditionalists, like Vance, of the techno, let's say Musk, and the national populists with Steve Bannon. Now, can the next guy keep the coalition together? That's not so sure. So that would be a way not to stop the backsliding, but at least give an opportunity to the other party to do something about it. So I have no time to go into the details of Russell Vought and his ideas. He wants a sort of, he thinks we are in a post-constitutional moment, and we being the right, they need to destroy all the apparatus that has been put in place during the New Deal and during the civil rights period. Remember, their enemy is what they call the administrative states, the agencies, which for them have captured the presidency. He uses an analogy by Bagehot, the British political author, who had described the double system, the double government, with the dignified institutions having no power and the real institutions. Now, to me, he thinks the presidency is a dignified institution, which is also another thing that would need to be discussed. So in that environment, I will ask two questions. Can the backsliding be stopped by the courts? And my answer is, well, not really. And second question, can the backsliding be stopped by the democratic process? Or I would add what is left of it after the gerrymandering and everything. So in order to answer the first question, can the courts limit the backsliding? Again, I won't focus on that, but we have to keep in mind the sources of populism, whatever definition. I mean, if Trump was able to capture so many people in 2016 and in 2024, which, by the way, raised the question raised by one of you, maybe this is what the American people wanted in 2024, because they knew exactly who he was. So can we push against the backsliding, against the population that wants the backsliding, which is another question. So again, I won't go into an equality about mistrust, the media, the elites, etc., but it's important to keep that in mind when we move to remedies, because if we don't take care of that, there'll be no remedies. So that the remedies have to be both on an economic level and an institutional level. Many others, I agree totally, it's a multifaceted thing that needs multifaceted solutions, but at least those two things. And I want to say that in order to answer my question, I have to look at the Supreme Court. And when I look at what the Supreme Court has been doing in the last 20 years, but especially in the last 15 months, the answer has to be the Supreme Court is not interested in defending the rule of law, and in fact has been a facilitator of the erosion, of the backsliding, etc. In several ways, very, very quickly, an important decision is the immunity decision, granting the president and the following presidents almost total immunity. This is important because when we get to what we need to do, which is hold the people accountable, it will be very difficult to hold Trump accountable because he's protected. He got criminal immunity from the Supreme Court decision. And if you follow the news in the US, you saw that a few days ago, the Attorney General gave him civil immunity for all his tax violations for the past until the day of the signature, which is going to save him lots of money, let's say. Probably not far from $1 billion of money he owes the Treasury. So the immunity decision, and then we have three other ways which are sort of complementary, having to do with the administrative state. In the Loper Bright decision, the court changed the rules entirely by reversing Chevron, 1984. The court at the time was conservative, and therefore, Mr. Scalia, Justice Scalia, was very happy to say, well, it's important that the courts pay deference to agencies. Now, the situation is different, and suddenly, Loper Bright, Mr. Roberts, the Chief Justice, says, no, this is no longer the rule. And then we have other decisions in the same field, depriving agencies of their power to punish, and this is the SEC versus Jacques decision, also in 2024. Agencies in the US, I mean, this is very typical, have three types of powers: legislative, issuing regulations; executive, enforcing the regulations; and quasi-judicial, punishing the bad guys. And that decision, the court said, no, you cannot impose fines. Those guys that have stolen so much money from the SEC, insider trading and the rest, they have a right to a hearing before a federal court. And then the court also okayed all the firings of employees of the agencies and heads of agencies. So I think it's Julia who mentioned the two decisions that are probably we're going to get them in the next few days, next few weeks, of Trump firing the head of the commissioner and trying to fire the one governor of the Federal Reserve. And that's the Lisa Cook decision. Well, I'm going to take a risk. I think the court will say, no, it cannot do that, because the court has realized that it's bad for business. But in the other case, Slaughter case, the court is very tempted to say, yes, Trump can fire Mrs. Slaughter. But then it will be interesting from a legal point of view to read the opinion and see how they manage to reconcile firing one person and not firing the rest when they all have the same legal status protected by long term in office. Longer for the Federal Reserve, that's true, but that's the idea. So that's one aspect in which the court is dismantling the rule of law. We also have to keep in mind that Roberts has always been a big enemy of the right to vote. When we look at the decisions rendered starting in 2013, Voting Rights Act, Section 5, then when we have Section 2, and a few days ago we have the Kelly decision, which says more or less, not only can we, the courts, not punish partisan gerrymandering, but we can do nothing about racial gerrymandering. So when a state in the South decides they don't want black representatives, well, that's too bad, we do nothing about it. This is a caricature, but it's more or less what the court has said. And I want to insist on that because it is less mentioned. By its decisions, the courts had facilitated the spread of corruption, both individual corruption and systemic corruption. Systemic corruption by its very narrow definition of corruption. So when we look at that, we have to answer my question. No, of course, the backsliding cannot be stopped by the courts. But there are two little rays of hope, the lower courts and the three liberal justices and their dissenting opinions. So when we look at the lower courts, we realize that whenever there is a case, so we mentioned the universities, we mentioned the media, the law firms too, whenever they go to court, they win. Mm-hmm. And it's not difficult to win because there is all the legal reasons to win. Now, what we hear a lot is the many occasions in which Trump decides to go to the Supreme Court, ask for an emergency ruling, and the bad thing, the Supreme Court saying, okay, whereas it doesn't have to agree to give the yes. And the statistics said it agreed to accept the emergency request by the Trump administration, but in 80% of the cases, the two-paragraph per curiam opinion was in favor. So that gives a strong impression that it's really bad, and it's really bad. Lots of people have written about the shadow docket, and if you know about Steve Vladek, if not, you can write his name. It's always very interesting, the way he shows that this is not the merits case, and also that the Supreme Court is trying to give precedential value, so the value of a precedent to a two-paragraph in which there is no legal explanation. So it looks very bad. But we have to realize that of the many, many cases, it's only a few that get, it's bad enough, but it's only a few. So we would need some more time to get a sort of more comprehensive overview of how bad is it, how much does it represent, does the Supreme Court act on the more important cases or not necessarily? Is it the decision of the Solicitor General? He knows he's going to win, so he asks and he wins. So I don't have the answers, but if we wanted to give an assessment, we would need to go into all the details about that. And the second ray of hope is the three justices. So you know that they write lots of dissenting opinions. The court doesn't render lots of opinions. We're talking about 56 last year. But they have a lot of work of the merits cases and all the shadow docket cases. And what's fascinating to me is that sometimes we have a two-paragraph per curiam saying, oh, lower court, you're wrong, no justification, no reasoning, no nothing. And then we have a 20-page dissenting opinion by one of the liberal justices. And some strategy we go into the details, we realize that, for instance, Sotomayor to some extent, but the new one, Jackson, writes very, very violent dissenting opinions, showing what the court is doing, what's their hidden agenda, and showing the dangers for democracy. And sometimes she's criticized for that. And we have Kagan, who is more of an institutionalist, trying to keep the dialogue, some dialogue, minimal dialogue open with the chief, and sometimes siding with the six. So we have, that's interesting, this term, a number of 7-2 decisions in which she decided to go with them so that she could do damage control and change the wording of a couple of paragraphs so that in the future it is less bad than it could have been. But she's very much criticized for that. She is accused of siding with the baddies, etc. So the next question, since there is not a lot of hope from the courts, we have to believe in the political process. So in order to move to that, we have to do damage control. That's why it's important to analyze everything that's happening, because if we want to move to the next step, how do we restore? We have to make little categories, typology, etc. For this, we would have to do that, etc. So there is damage control. There are also sort of preliminary issues that have to be dealt with. And unfortunately, it's not easy. If I think of one, the fight against disinformation, for me, it's vital, it is central, but we know that nothing can be done in the short term, which means that at least the 2026 election will take place in that environment of fake news, total disinformation, plus artificial intelligence, etc. And the other aspect, which is also but vital, is the attitude of political parties. Somebody mentioned polarization, but I want to mention the Democratic Party. The establishment, they have not done their homework. There is no willingness to accept the real reasons why they lost the election in 2024. And that's not good, because if you don't work on the reasons for your failure, how can you improve? So the good news is that at all levels, state, local, etc., there are a number of candidates that have understood that they should be focused on a number of subjects, and many of them have won so far. We'll see what happens in the 2026 election. But if we think that the remedy, the solution, the whatever is the political process, it means that there should be a large coalition before 2026 and probably 2028 of Democrats, of independents. The groups that has moved the most is the independents. Many of them voted for Trump, and now, of course, they are very much anti-Trump for the economic policy, especially the war in Iran, the never-Trumpers. And I talked to quite a few people in order to come up, in fact, with some kind of pragmatic conclusions. And they said two things which I thought was interesting. No purity test. In the Democratic Party, the left doesn't want to talk with the center, and vice versa. Everybody has to be perfect. And the second one is no identity politics. So you may not know him, but Barney Franks just died. He was a representative, the first gay person in Congress to admit that he was gay. And on his dying bed, he gave a long interview to the New York Times. And his sort of testament, his last will and testament is stop identity politics. If the population is not ready, of course we should defend LGBTQ people, but not promise everything, not do what Harris had done in the 2019 campaign when she said, yes, and the government should pay for transition operations for prisoners in California. This was used like 1 billion times in commercials during the campaign in 2024. So this is important, especially because the Republicans are so good at using cultural wars in order to hide their economic policies that are bad for the average person. So that the way to maybe change things would be to have the equivalent of Project 2025 with a mix of economic measures, institutional reforms, and I would like to add that, and I was reinforced by what happened in Hungary, a fight against corruption. I think the fact that Trump and the Trump administration acted so fast means that there is an awareness of what's going on, which was not the case in Hungary, for instance. So that would be a good news. But there is also awareness of all the people, all the cronies, all the allies of Trump making lots of money. And when we're talking lots of money, we're talking millions of dollars, and some of them billions of dollars, when the average American cannot put gas in their tank. So I think having corruption, which is a real problem in the US and has always been a problem, would be a good idea. As to the reforms, we have to define between what I would call statutory reforms, what can be done by Congress, and again, that requires Congress to change. Congress is powerful in the American system, but at the moment, the members of the Republican Party do not dare oppose the president. They do not dare establish their powers, whether the war powers, the budget powers, or whatever. And it is true that it's a difficult choice because the few that have resisted Trump lost their primary elections. Recently, Senator Bill Cassidy, a member of the House, Thomas Massie. So that when we say that Trump is on the way out, it is not so sure. He has still a huge control on the, I cannot call it Republican Party, but let's call the old Republican Party. So to conclude, and this is the result of a number of conversations I had, we need to be, we being the parties that want to change things, if, in my view, it has to go through the political process. They have to be aspirational. It's no longer time for little reforms of what is doable. They have to really, for instance, amendments. One, to finish immunity. One, to redefine the First Amendment and campaign finance. One, on protecting the right to vote. And maybe having terms, 18 years terms for the Supreme Court. I mean, really proposing things which, in a realistic fashion, have very little chance of happening. But if we don't try, we don't know. Second, act fast. Because it's a multifaceted problem, they have to act as fast on all fronts as the Trump administration has been acting fast on destroying. So as about trying to rebuild by law and inscribing into law what used to be unwritten traditions, like the independence of the Department of Justice, for instance. It's not written because the Department of Justice is part of Article 2, so under the hierarchy of the president, but along history, it has mostly been independent, except here when it's an instrument of retaliation by the president. Number 3, and that's very important to me, avoid Biden's mistake. Biden and his ill-chosen Attorney General, Merrick Garland, nice guy, but not equipped to be Attorney General in that period, they did not go after the people who incited maybe not Trump, but at least all the members of Congress, all the politicians, Giuliani, the guy who wrote the memo saying the vice president can refuse to certify Eastman. So there are at least 20 people that played an important role and nothing was done. And of course, for Trump, they waited so long to appoint the special prosecutor that it was too late. The public opinion had changed and there was nothing to be done. And go after corruption. And as to the people, and I speak to my friends, they try to resist, they go to the No Kings demonstrations, the lawyers fight in the civil society groups for immigrants, for this, for that, against the executive orders. But they say, fight cynicism, fight fear, like what Roosevelt said, fight division, and, very important, fight anticipatory obedience. That is to say, obeying because you are afraid, climate of fear, etc. And I promise it's finished, a quotation by Representative Ocasio-Cortez. She said that a few days ago. Somebody was mentioning Montgomery, so they were back in Montgomery to defend the right to vote, and she says, they being the bad guys, they do not know the sleeping giant that they just awakened. Because it's not a coincidence, and the whole country must understand that it was not until voting rights were ratified in this country that we got the great society. It's because when Black Americans have the right to vote and that vote is protected, our schools get funded. When voting rights are protected, healthcare gets expanded. When voting rights are protected, our country moves forward. And Montgomery, she's talking to the people in Montgomery, that's what they are actually afraid of. They're afraid of us coming together. They're afraid of us protecting one another. Thank you.
Thank you, Anne Deysine, for your very rich interventions. I'm sorry to have been obliged to remind you of the time running. It was very interesting to see that the hopes lies not in the Supreme Court, but in the lower court and also in the dissenting opinions of the judge. You stressed also the importance of damage control, acting fast,